Hi everyone, and welcome back to another Seraphim LinkedIn live session. Apologies, we had a slight technical issue, but we're back again with our session with UK Space Agency and Mark Boggett. So I'll start again. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Paul Bate. Paul has been the CEO of the UK Space Agency since September 2021. He leads a team of more than 250 people who provide the R&D funding to use space to increase prosperity across the world, protect the planet, and understand the universe. Prior to space, Paul ran the global sales at Babylon Health. And I'm also pleased to welcome Mark Boggett, who, if you follow us, you'll know he's a CEO of Seraphim Space. We're UK-based, but we're the most prolific space tech investor globally. Hi, both. Thanks for joining me. Right, we're going to get straight to the questions in the interest of time, but please, audience, do post questions in the chat, and we'll pick them up as we go along, and we'll pick them up at the end as well. So, Paul, as I just said in the intro, you're relatively new to the space industry. What did you do before you became CEO, and what do you think about the space industry? What drew you to it?
Well, so I've been at the agency for about 18 months now, so I'm in probably beyond that honeymoon period. But for about 20 years before I took the job as chief exec, I was working in the health sector, mostly on the commercial side, but quite a lot of health policy as well. So on the one hand, I was David Cameron's health advisor and Nick Clegg's health advisor for a while during the coalition years. In Downing Street, did quite a lot of work on regulation as well at the Care Quality Commission. But in my immediately previous job, as you mentioned there, I was running the sales across Babylon Health. That's an AI medtech firm. It's about 100 people when I joined, about 2,500 when I left, and had just gone through a SPAC process. So I got to learn quite a lot about what it means to be, meeting your figures, meeting your numbers each quarter, and preparing for a big stock market event. I'd also set up a company before then, but if I go back long enough, my starting point and my heart, if I'm absolutely honest, is in the science side. So my PhD is in particle physics, quite a sort of strong bit of astrophysics within that. So I kind of got seduced to the into healthcare for 20 years. That was a detour, and now I'm back and enjoying every moment of space.
Amazing to go back to what you love. How does the industry shape up, Paul, to your expectations prior to joining? What are the elements that have surprised you, and positively and negatively?
Yeah, so I was really lucky. I got loads of really good advice and one or two bits of corkingly bad advice at the same time. The only bit I'd pull out was really bad advice. Was someone saying to me, the thing you have to understand about the space sector in the UK is that it's very new, it's very nascent, it's kind of cottage industry. Don't confuse it with anything mature like you had used to in healthcare. And that's absolute rubbish, right? It's, there is a wall of new companies, of course, who are innovating and setting themselves up and getting to scale in the UK. But there's real heritage as well. So the idea that 50,000 people constitutes a cottage industry is for the birds, in my view. It's a sector that is maturing, that's really, I think, picking some really important areas, whether that's SATCOMs or AI or robotics, software engineering more generally, where we've got real strengths globally. And the thing that I get more often than not, I have the fortune of being the so-called head of delegation to the European Space Agency. So I sit around the European Space Agency Council table, and often people will sidle up to me or sort of lean in and say, do you know how lucky you are in the UK that your space sector starts from a kind of commercial, industrial, scientific perspective? You don't have this sort of big institutional kind of overhang that can cramp the style. So that wasn't something I knew when I joined, but quite quickly discovered. We have something really quite unique in the UK, and that is not just on the space supply side. I mean, Mark, I'm sure we'll talk more about it, but having an organization like Seraphim blasting the way in which space investment is done, we can see the rest of the world looking to us in the way we have this sort of more investment focus and commercial focus.
So true. Thanks, Paul. Mark, on that, let's go to the investment side. How does the UK compare internationally in terms of investment and growth? Are we a global player?
We certainly are, and I'm proud to say that Seraphim's playing its part in driving UK investment. We're a listed UK vehicle on the London Stock Exchange, but we're the most prolific investor globally in the space domain, with a portfolio of 105 companies today. So next, I'm going to talk about some of the global trends and highlight the UK's position in that. So the figures that I'm just about to quote are sourced from the Seraphim Space Index, which is available on our website. So we've been producing this quarterly since 2017, where we demonstrate the trends in global private investment into the space domain. So I'm going to look back over the last 3 years to try and draw out the trends. So total investment in 2020 was $6.3 billion, increasing to $9.9 billion, and then back down to $6.8 billion last year. So from the UK company perspective, if you include OneWeb, the UK companies accounted for 14% of this total global investment over that 3-year period. Now, if you take OneWeb out as an outlier, the UK falls quite considerably, down to 2% in 20, 2% in 21, and then jumped to 4% in 2022. But actually look at this from the perspective of the number of companies that have been financed over that period. There's a different view. So in 2020 there were 125 companies financed globally. That increased to 294 companies last year. The UK accounted for between 12 and 15% of the total companies funded over that period. So the UK is really punching above our weight in terms of the number of companies that were funded. So let's just break this down one step further by looking at this from a European perspective. So Europe, including the UK, accounted for 7% of total investment in 2020. In 2021, it was 7%, and then in 22, it jumped to 15%. So in terms of companies funded, Europe ranges from about 24 to 32% over that period, with the UK accounting for around a third of all of the investment across those European companies. And actually, if you included OneWeb in that, that would jump to 2/3. But in terms of the companies invested, the UK accounts for 49% of all of Europe in 2020, falling to 42% in 2021 and 36% last year. So the UK is on a downward trend relative to Europe. And this is reflective of measures that have been implemented in the EU to invest specifically in space companies that hasn't yet been reflected in the UK market.
Brilliant. Thanks for explaining that, Mark. Paul, I'll go back to you. The UK made a huge commitment in the recent ESA budget. What does this mean for the UK over the next few years?
So there's a lot to cover in what happened in that those 3 days in November in Paris, where all of the 22 member states of the European Space Agency came together, and we each, we'd obviously talked to our finance ministries beforehand. And we went out with the ministers, with George Freeman in our case, to decide how much money we wanted to put into the European Space Agency for the next 5 years. So I could talk about the particular missions that we secured leadership on, whether that's Rosalind Franklin mission to search for past life on Mars, the Vigil Space Weather Mission, Aeolus 2, it's a critical climate change mission looking at wind speeds, Moonlight, looking at lunar comms and navigation, the Truth mission, which is a very largely UK-sponsored mission, setting the kind of climate standard on calibration from space. So a whole range of missions that we were able to invest in, and because we got judiciously negotiated, we got the leadership in all the areas that we wanted, and one or two more. In financial terms, 1.84 billion, that was the biggest amount the UK has ever committed to the European Space Agency. But I think it's worth just putting out two extra parts on this. So one is that in amongst it all, we were also in the position to secure 3 astronauts for the UK. That's more than we've ever had. That's Rose Coogan as the new career astronaut, taking over the mantle from Tim Peake. That's Meg Christian as our reserve astronaut, and the world's first para-astronaut, as well as Paralympian, in John McFall. So for some people, the astronauts are not just the icing on the cake, they're fundamental to the appreciation of bringing space into day-to-day life. So it was really good to secure more astronauts than any other member state. But more importantly, I think that anything else was the statements we made about how we may not be, we're not in the European Union anymore, but that makes it more important that we're at the centre of the European Space Agency. We're a founding member, and we used the ministerial in November to confirm that we sit at the heart of the European Space Agency and that we have expectations of it. We're not a sort of passive taker. We have a very clear agenda. We want to see that commercialisation and that drive to make the very best of the UK space sector. And that while we are open for business across the world, we have new funds in place for bilateral relationships with the US, with Canada, with Japan, with Australia. We are 100% committed to Europe and the European Space Agency.
Fascinating. Thanks, Paul. What about the innovation? Where can the UK lead in terms of innovation?
Well, that's sort of, I think, in some way a link in from the question on the on what we did at ESA, because I could have kind of talked about from the innovation programs that we deliberately fund. So we're one of the biggest funders of the future telecoms work through the so-called ARTES program, because we recognise we've got this leadership role in telecoms and telecoms payloads, and we're really keen to make sure that we maintain that. Sometimes in the industry, I know we think that upstream is everything, that the satellites and the exploration is all that we that the space sector is, and of course it isn't. We are just as active in the data science, in the downstream, in the software engineering, the artificial intelligence, and of course linked to that, the robotics that goes with it. I find it quite hard to find an area where we're just, we're not interested. I just get a little shout out for the work that we're doing around space sector policy and the capabilities work, space capabilities that we're doing with the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology and their Space Directorate, so that we can be clearer later this year about particular capabilities that we want to fund and promote in the UK. But the short answer to the question is that we are awash with opportunities to build on our existing strengths in technology, and of course to look to what are going to be the big trends of the future, whether that's the lunar economy, it's why we invested in, for example, in Moonlight, whether it's the space nuclear economy and the work that we're already doing with Rolls-Royce and the National Nuclear Laboratory and the University of Leicester, or whether it's space-based solar power. The great thing, I think, right now about the space sector, it's got an incredible opportunity to demonstrate to the world just how wide it is and how the applications aren't just for any second just about traditional space activity. It's just about as much how we power the insurance sector or the transport sector or the agriculture sector as it is the more traditional space sectors of telecoms, navigation, Earth observation, and of course space science.
Yeah, I think you've touched upon my next question there. I was going to say, with what makes the UK such a great place for space tech investment, but I think you've said a lot of that about the innovation, what we're creating here. But what, in your opinion, what's the most important?
Well, I think all those things are important in that question. But I'd also bring, we have the City of London, and I pass over to Mark to kind of really sort of talk about what the investment community can do. But without capital, there is no sector. We have to have that ability to grow, and we need to fuel that growth. So we have one of the fundamental financial centres of the world, and we have a regulatory framework which is safe and is secure and is new in 2018, which many other countries are now looking to copy and to ask us for our advice on. So we've got stable regulation, we've got investment, we've got the sector itself, we've got all sorts of customers outside the traditional space sector. And of course, we've got the universities. We've got 4 of the top 10 universities in the world. And in our war for talent, recognizing that we've got some of the best talent, whether it's in the space sector or could be in the space sector, is a real competitive advantage for the UK.
Yes, thank you, Paul. Mark, can you outline some of the key emerging investment trends that are in the UK space industry at the moment? Yeah,
so from a stage perspective, the UK has really mirrored international trends. So that means that significant money is still being pouring into early stage investments. Indeed, in recent quarters, new records have been set for seed and Series A stage companies. Whilst investment into growth stage companies is down by value, but largely flat on volume. And that suggests that the later stage growth companies are taking bridging rounds rather than going back out to the market to raise big fresh rounds of capital. So from a sector perspective, the UK has been supporting homegrown launch capability. So we've seen some really big investments into companies like Orbex and reaction engines. Now, most of the funding's actually gone into a sector that we call product. So these are companies that are using satellite data, but only as part of their proposition. So not surprisingly, climate-related companies are getting most of the capital. So names like B0 Carbon, Manifest Climate, and Resilience were some of the biggest investments during the last 12 months. And the third biggest segment for investment is one that we call Analyze. So these are the companies whose proposition is built around analyzing data from satellites. So we've seen some big rounds into companies like Planet Watchers that's focused on the insurance market.
Thank you, Mark. Paul, I'll go back to you. What major challenges are the UK space industry currently facing, and what are we doing to solve those problems?
Challenges in the space sector or challenges in the space agency?
Industry in general.
Yeah, thanks. Well, so I think we've got the challenges that everyone's got on supply chain, for example, and inflation. So there's a whole set of global trends that we are definitely not immune from. I think one of the things historically we have, as a country, we rely very heavily for operational capability in space. We look to our relations with the European Union for Galileo, for Copernicus, for example. And then on the military side, we had operational capabilities like Skynet. Now, when we came out of the European Union, that changed. So we were no longer in Galileo, and we've not been in Copernicus. We'll see where that goes. But I do think it's a fundamental challenge for us all. Is what's the set of operational capabilities in civil space that we want? That's the work that is going on right now. And I think it's important just to face directly into it, whether it's Earth observation or it's navigation or comms or beyond. I think that is a challenge for the sector. I think it's one that we're rising to, but one that we need to recognize that other countries have bigger customer requirements, if you like, in civil space from government than we currently have.
Thank you, Paul. Mark, you mentioned a couple of companies earlier, I think, but can you, any specific companies in the UK that you want to highlight that you think are leading the way at the moment?
Yeah, so two companies that are UK companies that I think are leading globally in their field are All.Space and Satellite View. So All.Space is a leading player in the flat panel antenna market. So this company uniquely sells a miniaturized antenna that can be used on any mobile vehicle, so a car, boat, plane, train, tank, etc. And what they're able to do is connect to 5 satellites simultaneously. Those satellites can be in low Earth orbit, mid-Earth orbit, geostationary orbit, and this is a unique capability in order to be able to access connectivity on a moving vehicle. So All.Space is very much leading the way and flying the flag globally, winning big contracts with that technology. Then we've got Satellite View. So this is a company that has the most advanced capability for infrared in space. So what they're able to do with their capability from space is to look down and actually be able to see inside buildings, a thermal image of what's going on. So that can tell you a lot of things. Is that oil rig in use? Is that property in use? That production facility, is it running on 1 shift, 2 shift, or 3 shifts? But you can also look at a building and determine its thermal efficiency so that you can identify where money should be spent in order to address buildings. So these are 2 examples of UK companies that are really leading internationally.
Great, fascinating stuff and some great real world examples there. I don't want to go too deep into regulation, but I've got a small question on that for you, Paul. What is the current regulatory environment in the UK space tech, and how is it challenging, and what could be improved to help the industry top level?
So the regulatory framework came into force in 2021 after the Space Industry Act. That includes the regulations for launching satellites, for the launchers themselves, for the range. So pretty much everything that you want to do in space, we have the regulatory framework for, pretty much. What I think is certainly in Europe, of course, is unique is that it's been tested in anger through the launch in Cornwall earlier this year. So while ultimately the satellites didn't get into the orbits that they needed to, so that part wasn't a success. What it did mean is we could test all aspects of the regulatory framework and show that they were successful. That, of course, includes all the safety elements of those licenses. So we know that this works. But we also know that we need to continue developing it. There's another round of consultation going on right now at the moment, developing particularly on things like liability limits. The aim for our regulatory structure is to make sure that it's a safe and secure place to launch and to be a satellite operator or a manufacturer, but it's also a welcoming place. It's got to be agile. And that's a constant dilemma for any regulator. I was a regulator for several years. You constantly got to work through how you balance or make a virtue of the fact that you've got a safe environment. It'll be very easy to create a regulatory environment with just a race to the bottom, but that benefits nobody at all on Earth, with all the risks of a failed launch that wasn't safe, nor in the orbital environment if that leads to so much space debris that we then can't use our particular orbits anymore. So the aim in the UK is to continue to develop the regulatory structure so that it's welcoming and it's safe. That's what we're doing.
Great stuff. Thank you, Paul. What about what benefits does the space industry bring to the UK economy? And I think we've touched on it again, and Mark touched on it, but what sectors is this affecting the most? I think people don't realise that it's a kind of infecting everything in our planet. Yeah.
I mean, you're absolutely right, because every day you decide to use Google Maps. It's just there you go. To put it another way, if we lose the signal from space on position, navigation, and timing, every day we will lose about £1 billion from the UK economy. That's the Blackett Review analysis. So it is fundamental to the basics of getting around. It's fundamental to our ability to communicate with each other through satellite communications. That's true in this country. Of course, we've got something like 10% of the world which doesn't have access to broadband. The idea that that is going to be done terrestrially is for the birds, right? So the opportunity to make sure that everybody is connected is a space opportunity. And if we're talking about the climate emergency, over half of all the so-called essential climate variables, the things that really matter for understanding whether we're on track for 1.5 degrees, they come from space. The data for over half of those through the Earth observation satellites. So those are kind of great examples, I think, of how our everyday lives are finally already governed by space before we get onto autonomous vehicles or next generation telecoms technologies. And the truth is, we can't see the satellite that's floating above our heads, but our lives are already intimately bound up with space. My argument is not really a sector in that traditional vertical way. It's much more of the next generation domain, much as the internet was, and cyber and quantum, absolutely cross-cutting. All the elements of our lives are going to increasingly be powered by space.
Brilliant, thanks, Paul. And Mark, why now? Why is now such a good time to invest in space, and what's changed recently?
Yeah, so the space market's gone through a revolution in recent years. Low-cost launch by companies like SpaceX have reduced the cost of launch by 100x. There's 150 other rocket launch companies behind SpaceX. The trend for the price of a kilo into space is going down. Then at the same time, there's been a revolution in the satellite industry. Satellites that used to be the size of a bus, costing $1 billion, are now moving and morphing into satellites that are the size of a microwave or the size of a shoebox that costs a few $1 million. So if you bring these two things together, low-cost launch, low-cost miniaturized satellites, we're now in an era where it's possible to put up constellations of satellites of hundreds or even thousands of satellites. And building upon what Paul has just said, what that's going to result in is a digital infrastructure in the sky. It's effectively like the creation of a new internet, but in space. All of these satellites are able to communicate with our planet, but they're also able to actually look down at Earth and monitor and audit everything that's going on in very high resolution, low cost, close to real time. That can help us use resources more efficiently. It can help us hold bad actors to account. So the opportunity is, though, that we're only just at the foothills of this growth in this market. So there's only ever been 18,000 satellites that have been launched since Sputnik. 8,000 satellites in space today that are operational, and yet 80% of those were launched in just the last 3 years. So the growth is really still very much ahead of us. And think about how, as Paul just mentioned, GPS, that blue dot in your mobile phone, think about how that's become a utility that we all rely upon every day. Well, the next generation of Earth observation is a green dot in your mobile phone, but that knows much more than just your location and the time. It knows everything that's happened in that area in the last hour, the last day, the last month, the last year. And that's really going to create tremendous value in virtually every vertical that you can think of, from insurance through maritime, oil and gas, real estate. There really isn't a vertical that isn't going to be disrupted by this. And this is creating a $1 trillion market opportunity. But the playing field is very much leveled. And the UK and other countries are backing their entrepreneurs to go and find the business cases that uses this data set and this communication capability from space.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. I think we've had a few questions from the audience, so please keep them coming. We'll take them in a second. I'll take one final question for both of you guys. Just what excites you both, and why do you love this industry? And, you know, what would you tell someone who wants to work in it or invest in it, or from either of your perspectives? Mark, you first.
Okay, right. Well, you know, building on what I just said there, really, space has got the potential to save humanity. So that's a big statement. So it starts off today by using this digital infrastructure to better monitor our planet, to use resources more efficiently, to hold bad actors to account, those that are dumping effluent in seas, chopping down rainforests, etc. Tomorrow, the next stage is about building infrastructure in space. And this is why the cost of accessing to space is so important. We're talking about building solar farms in space that are going to provide clean energy to our planet. Data centers in space to manage all of this massive amount of data that we've just been talking about. Manufacturing in space, lifting dirty industries from planet Earth to protect our precious planet and moving those into a different environment. So space is positioned to be able to address many of the biggest challenges faced by humanity, but at the same time, it's a $1 trillion market opportunity that is open for everyone to get involved with.
Great. And what about you, Paul? What excites you? What would you like to tell everyone? I can't hear him. Is that me? There's no sound. I think you're on mute. Mark, can you hear Paul?
Should we go to questions?
Yeah, I don't know. I didn't know if it was just me or not, but Paul, we can't hear you. Perhaps you're on mute.
This is live TV. let's go to the questions whilst we get Paul sorted out. Okay,
Mark. So someone's asked a question about space debris. Are there any UK companies that are leading in space debris, or?
There are many companies focused on space debris. We have been investing into many of the companies that have now become leaders in the field. So one of the leaders is actually a Japanese company called Astroscale, but they've very much made the UK their home. They currently employ over 100 people and are one of the leading companies globally in space debris removal and also life extension. So debris removal is about removing satellites that have reached the end of their life or they have broken down, so that these satellites don't add to the debris already in space. We talked about an environment here where there's going to be hundreds or even thousands of satellites, so it's really important that we address that. They also focus on life extension. So a satellite that's reached the end of its economic life, rather than that satellite being retired, it's now possible to actually start providing new capabilities to that satellite by attaching to it, providing it more power or even more capabilities of updated technology solutions. So this is all going on right now, and there's many companies. In fact, we've got 4 companies in our portfolio that focus on this particular area. But there's actually been recent changes in regulation that are really driving this activity. So this is really emanating from the States and from the FCC. Historically, the rules allowed satellite operators 25 years for their satellites to be removed from space, and that coincided with the sort of typical time period that it took for satellites to be sort of drawn down by the atmosphere and to burn up in the Earth's atmosphere. Now that is now being moved to a 5-year period, and this regulation is due to be made official within a number of weeks. And that is really going to further extend the industry around debris removal and ensuring that space is a long-term sustainable market for commercial growth.
Thanks for explaining. I think that's an important issue for lots of people, Mark. Let's take another. Hopefully, we've got Paul back now. Paul? Oh, no. Well, this is a bit of a shame. He can continue. So let me have a look at the questions. Mark, is there any that you want to particularly pick up?
So, well, the one that's just come in is about what's the largest current bottleneck that's slowing the industry's growth within the UK. So, so there's 2 that I would draw attention to. One still remains launch. So even though we've talked about launch and the number of companies that are coming to market, there is still not enough launch capacity to meet demand. So so companies can wait up to a year in order to be able to sort of access the launch that they're looking for. And these launches are also still delayed by potentially a quarter or 2. And that remains a challenge for the industry, but one that we've got real confidence is going to be addressed over the short to medium term. The other thing, and this is particularly true in the UK, is a limited amount of growth capital that's available to support the growth of these companies. And it's not that growth capital isn't available globally, it is. But in the UK, we only have a limited amount of funds that are growth stage investors that are prepared to invest in asset classes like the space market. So as a consequence, it's challenging to raise the hundreds of millions that are required to build out some of these businesses. So what that can lead to, and what that does lead to, is promising UK companies that have been founded in the UK, they've been financed through the earlier stages. All of the risk has largely been removed from those businesses. But in order to access the capital that they need to scale, they then have to go to the US or elsewhere overseas in order to be able to access that capital. So that's a big problem. And actually, though, it's one that's really recognised by UK government. And this is not specific to space, but there's a move underway at the moment to enable pension funds to be able to invest large sums of money into the venture and private equity community to provide significantly more growth capital to the existing investors that are operating in the market. So that's something that I'm hopeful is going to be addressed over the next 6 months to a year, and that is going to have a tremendous impact, particularly on the space market.
Thank you, Mark. Is he back?
Think I might be.
Brilliant. Thank you. Sorry about that, everyone. You know, these technical issues. I think, Paul, we'll take a question for you. There was a question at the beginning. Let me just find it. That I think if you could tell all MPs one thing they need to know about the UK space industry, what would it be?
All 650. So I would highlight some things that we've talked about what an opportunity is and how it goes so much further than the traditional space. So I'd make that case, and I do make that case. Actually, the one thing I would say is that they have to go now. That other countries are doing this. So we already operate on a sometimes 2-to-1 or 3-to-1 less investment than some other countries do. And that's a deliberate choice. But we need to recognise we've got to get the funding into the UK space sector. And so for all these opportunities, I can build the picture of all the amazing things that can be done in space and will be done in space. But the one message I want people to leave is this isn't one you can kick down the road 5 or 10 years. This is a decade which is going to define globally how we do space, whether it's space farms or space nuclear or any of the things we've talked about. So it's important to continue the ramp up now from the government side.
There's a good question there, Leah, that I think would be good for Paul to answer and then me to follow up on, which it says, this is all very well and good driving innovation as quick as our investors can carry us. But what about the skills implications and the widening skill gaps and recruitment difficulties as a result? So, Paul, do you want to touch that? And then I'd be happy to comment on that as well.
Yeah, happy to, Mark. It's a good question, and and there aren't simple answers. I mean, I give happy pat answers, but it's very real. The analysis that we've done is that we need at least 30,000 more jobs to fuel the skills, or to close the skills gap, to close the capacity gap, to grow the space sector in the way that we all want to. I think it is worth saying that this isn't just the traditional space manufacturing roles. It really is an abundance of opportunity right across all the engineering disciplines, design disciplines, across communications, HR, finance, because it's such a growth industry. So it's worth saying this is wide, but it is a genuine problem. So some of the things that the Space Agency does, so we actively support the apprenticeships campaign, and we spread so we can spread the costs of developing new training opportunities. We have this thing called SPIN, the internship program. That's already helped 400 students to get working in the sector. There is a Space Skills Advisory Panel, which is the way of bringing everybody's knowledge together so we solve this in the right way. And that includes working with the rest of the government, including things like the UKRI, who sort of controls all the research councils. So we've got a single strategy for space skills. Those are some of the things that we're doing, but it is very real. What I don't buy, and occasionally I hear this is just a problem for government to solve. I don't think that's true in any sector. I don't think it's true in space. So government has a role to play in housing, but it's fundamentally industry-wide and academia. We all have to pull our weight to close the skills gap, because it's a bit like capital. Obviously, we don't have skills or we don't have capital, then we can't grow.
Just to build on that then, so space is a global market. We're operating in a global market. And one of actually the areas that the UK does very well in from a skills perspective is around data science capability. Now, the types of companies that we've been heavily investing into, those that are building this digital infrastructure, how they're actually going to make money from that data is around using artificial intelligence in order to be able to glean insights and trends that are then valuable to many end verticals. So one of the key hiring areas for the whole space market is around data scientists and those that have got AI and machine learning skills. The UK really has a significant pool of talent in this area, and we're also from a wage perspective, we're very well positioned relative to the US market. So what that means is, and what we're seeing increasingly, is that there are international companies that are establishing themselves in the UK in order to access this pool of talent that's absolutely vital to them to be able to monetize this data that they're enabling from space. We've got the best universities. We've been focused on this area for a long time, and we've got a competitive pool of talent.
Great, thanks, Mark. We'll take a question, an investment question for you, Mark. Is the UK investing in more of the small satellite launch companies who operate within the UK, which better suit our needs?
So yes, so we talked about Orbex. So Orbex was one of the companies that received the most amount of funding in the last quarter globally. So this is a company that is backed in the UK by some of the leading investors, Octopus and BGF. There is significant funding available for UK to be able to have its own capability in this area. There are other companies in the UK that are also in launch, companies like Skyrora that have gone on and raised significant amounts of money. So this is an area that the UK investors are certainly willing to support.
Paul, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, a little bit. So this point about having the private investment community alongside the public investment, I think really matters. Launch a really good example of it. So the space agency has put about £40 million, a bit more actually, into launch already. So that's funded Orbex, as Mark mentioned. It also funded the Virgin Orbit launch in January, and it's funding a Pathfinder launch up on the Shetland Islands from the Saxonboard spaceport. So we think it's really important to configure the space sector in an open, commercial way.
Yep.
Okay.
Should we move on to the next question? Should we, Leah?
We've lost Paul again. Apologies, everyone. I'm sure he'll be back. There's an interesting question about the lunar economy, Mark. I think this fascinates a lot of people. When do you think we'll have a lunar economy, i.e. inhabitants, mining capability, nearby asteroids, etc.? Just explain a little bit about the lunar economy.
Yeah, so the Artemis Accords has really put the focus back on the moon, and there's an incredible number of companies that have now been established in order to be able to address this opportunity of permanent habitation on the moon. So in fact, we've recently released a map that looks at hundreds of companies in each of the different subcategories of the capabilities that are required to put man on the moon. So when are we going to have man on the moon? I think that Paul might be better to give us a response on that. What I can say is that there is considerable amount of investment going into this now from a very, very broad number of companies around the world. Paul, can you provide us with any more insight as to when that's going to happen?
Yeah, so Artemis 3 will be putting people on the moon, the first person of color, the first woman on the moon, all planned for around 2025. So it's really, really close now to sort of move on from the Apollo generation to the Artemis generation. Fueling that lunar economy, the big difference, I guess, between Apollo came for a few days and then returned. It was fundamentally a bit about flags and footprints. It's very different now. I think we will see a lot more internationalism on the moon. We already launched the Lunar Pathfinder through SSTL, so starting the lunar comms. We're really focusing as a country and as a space agency in getting into the front of the lunar economy, whether that's supporting the industry that will be on the ground, commercial and institutional, with navigation and communication services, but also, for example, we recently funded Rolls-Royce on microreactors to power the bases on the moon. So I think we'll look back at the end of the decade, and we won't just have got back, but I think we'll have a much stronger presence, potentially a permanent presence on the moon and around the moon with the Lunar Gateway. It's really very close. And of course, we'll be going to Mars robotically at the end of this decade. Now, it'll be an interesting conversation about when will the first person be on Mars, let alone the moon. We don't know exactly when that will be, but I put money on the fact that person is alive.
Amazing, fascinating stuff. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mark. We've had so many questions, and we've gone on, I think, longer than we said we would. So that's absolutely excellent. And I think we can take the time to answer some of the questions on our channel when we finish. But maybe we'll take one more question before we go. Paul, do you want to pick one?
Well, there's a good one. So I wouldn't mind just adding to two or three of the points on launch. Just to sort of take that, I know I'll try and sort of bring two or three of them together. There was a question on Virgin Orbit in there. And Virgin Orbit blazed the trail with the first launch from Europe, right? And the first, obviously, in the UK as a result. If whether or not VO comes successfully out of Chapter 11, no, it won't affect the UK's launch ambitions, because we set things up as a competitive, as having many more than one iron in the fire. So I'm very confident that whatever happens with Virgin Orbit, we have the capability for launch from the UK in the years to come. I would have thought we will certainly have been launched by 2024, for example. But I think the overall bit I would try and get over is there is something very special about the UK space sector in the way that it is structured, and always good to build on the strengths. So the fact that we're commercial by nature and we're not overly institutionalized really plays to our strengths.
Amazing, thank you. Mark, anything to end on?
No more comments from me. Thank you, Paul, for joining us on this LinkedIn Live, and I apologise for some of the tech issues we've had along the way.
No, well, whatever was on whichever side, my apologies to everybody, and thank you very much.
Thank you both for joining me, and thanks to everyone for listening. And please keep the questions coming, and it will be recorded. It will be shown on our channel, and we can answer more questions, and you can watch it all back. So thanks again. Thanks everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Bye.